In 2019, a desperate 911 call shattered the silence of the night. A man's voice trembled through the line. "There's a man. He's not breathing. He's in my car." Police arrived within minutes. In the passenger seat, they found a man motionless, his body bearing multiple injuries. The streetlights cast eerie shadows over the scene, but one thing was clear. Something terrible had happened. The authorities immediately began their investigation. Who was this man? How did he end up here? And most importantly, why had his life come to such a brutal end? As officers questioned those nearby, a young man stepped forward. His hands were shaking, his face pale. "It was me," he admitted. "I was the one who did it." But this wasn't just a random act of violence. No, this was personal. To understand what happened that night, we must go back in time. This was not a crime of impulse. It was the result of years of resentment, humiliation, and bottled-up anger. The young man, whom we will call Daniel, had always carried a heavy weight on his shoulders. Since childhood, there had been someone in his life who tormented him, a man who never let him live in peace. Every time he saw me, he laughed. He mocked me. He said things I can't repeat. It was endless. But it wasn't just words. This man made it his mission to humiliate Daniel at every opportunity. He pushed him, insulted him, and treated him like he was nothing. And for Daniel, every moment of suffering was slowly building up like a ticking time bomb. One night, that bomb finally exploded. It was past midnight. The house was dark, silent, but Daniel couldn't sleep. He had an uneasy feeling. Something wasn't right. Then he heard it. A sound. A whisper. A presence. He quietly stepped out of his room and made his way down the hall. As he approached the living room, his heart began to race. And then he saw him. The man who had tormented him for years was standing in his own house. But he wasn't alone. He was with my mother. And when he saw me, he froze. Then he turned and ran. At that moment, Daniel lost control. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't reasoning. He was reacting. This was his moment. With his pulse pounding, he bolted after the man, through the hall, out the door, down the street, a chase in the dead of night. I just wanted to stop him, to make him face me, to make him answer for everything he had done. And when he finally caught up to him, everything changed forever. Daniel's breath was heavy as he closed the distance between him and the man who had tormented him for years. The cold night air burned his lungs, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The man sprinted through the dark streets, desperate to escape. But Daniel had too much anger, too much pain. This wasn't just a chase. It was years of humiliation catching up. Finally, on an empty road, the man stumbled. That was Daniel's chance. "You think you can just run after everything?" Daniel kicked him in the leg, forcing him to the ground. The man groaned, trying to stand, but Daniel wasn't finished. "This is the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where I could finally make him feel as weak as I did." The man tried to fight back, pushing Daniel away. The two struggled, shoving and swinging wildly in the dimly lit street. Then, Daniel felt something in his pocket. His hand wrapped around the handle of a knife. Daniel had never planned for things to go this far, but rage has no limits. In the heat of the struggle, he pulled out the knife. The street light flickered above them, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. The man saw the knife. His face changed. That was the first time I had ever seen him afraid. The man broke free, stumbling backward. He knew he had to run. Daniel hesitated for a split second. I could have stopped there. I could have let him go. But he didn't. Just then, Daniel's friend appeared. He had seen what was happening and rushed over, thinking he could stop the fight before it got worse. "Daniel, let it go. Stop this." But Daniel wasn't listening anymore. He was past the point of reason. The man had gotten away from his grip again, running down the street. But this time, Daniel was determined to end it. He looked around frantically, and his eyes locked onto a heavy piece of stone by the sidewalk. He grabbed it. It was cold, rough. It felt like revenge. Without thinking, he hurled the stone at the man's leg. It hit hard. A crack echoed through the night. The man collapsed, clutching his leg in pain. He gasped, looking up at Daniel with wide, terrified eyes. "Please, don't do this." For a moment, Daniel stood there. His breath was shaking. His heart pounded. The man was at his mercy. And then Daniel made the choice that would change his life forever. The man lay on the cold pavement, gripping his broken leg. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. His hands trembled as he tried to pull himself away, but there was nowhere left to run. "Please, you don't have to do this," he whispered. For the first time that night, Daniel hesitated. Was this enough? Years of humiliation, pain, and fear had led him to this moment. He had won. The man who tormented him was on the ground, helpless. But rage doesn't listen to reason. Daniel's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. His mind was screaming, telling him to stop, but his emotions had taken full control. He looked around, his thoughts racing. His friend stood nearby, watching in shock. "Daniel, it's over. Just walk away." But it wasn't over. Not for Daniel. His eyes locked onto his shirt. The belt. The man's breath hitched as Daniel slowly removed the belt from his shirt. His friend took a step forward, panic in his voice. "Daniel, listen to me. Stop now before it's too late." But Daniel was no longer listening. His hands gripped the belt tightly as he stepped closer. He always thought he had power over me, but now I was the one in control. The man tried to crawl backward, but Daniel grabbed him. For a split second, their eyes met. The man's fear was raw, real. Then, everything went silent. When Daniel finally stepped back, it was over. The night was eerily quiet as Daniel stood there, heart pounding. The weight of what he had done settled onto his shoulders. His friend stood frozen in shock, unable to process what had just happened. "We need to go," Daniel whispered. His voice was hollow, as if he barely recognized himself. He walked away from the scene, his breath shaky. When he reached home, his mother and sister were waiting. "It's over," he told them. But deep down, he knew it would never be over. By morning, the police had already launched an investigation. Daniel tried to act normal, but he knew it was only a matter of time. And he was right. It didn't take long before the police came knocking. The evidence, the witnesses, it all pointed to him. Daniel was arrested, his fate sealed. As he sat in the interrogation room, staring at the cold walls, he finally understood. There is no true victory in revenge. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't heal the wounds. It only creates new ones. Final message to viewers. Crime is never the answer. Anger fades,